The first image that returns to him is not the body, but the sound of the wind rattling the loose pane in her bedroom window. Years later, that sound still arrives in his mind before everything else, before the soft hum of the ceiling fan, before the faint murmur of voices in the hallway, before the sheet drawn too neatly over her shape. It is a sound of something unsettled, tapping and trembling against its frame, asking to be noticed and never quite breaking through. That is how he remembers her, not in the stark stillness of that night in 1992, but in the gentle disruption she left behind. A presence that would not quite go, even when everyone in Auburn Grove agreed, with hushed voices and careful eyes, that it was time to let the matter rest. Her name was Collier, 28 years old, born just outside Montgomery, raised in a family that measured worth in patience and quiet service. She moved to Alabama for work, to teach literature at the local high school. Her students called her Ms. Eve, because it felt softer, like the beginning of something rather than an ending. She read them poems in a low, steady voice and underlined lines that talked about longing and home and the spaces between people. When they found her, the story settled quickly into a shape that made sense to tired minds. A note on the nightstand, written in small, careful script. A bottle of pills neatly placed. No signs of struggle. No marks. No broken glass. No scattered furniture. The sheriff at the time said the same word again and again until it started to sound like a verdict instead of a possibility. "Looks like she did this herself," he had said, palms open, as if he wanted no part of it beyond the saying. But even then, the wind had tapped at the window as if disagreeing. Back then, Jonah had been new to the department, still learning how to stand in small rooms filled with large absence. He was the one who noticed her shoes, lined up too precisely at the foot of the bed, toes touching the edge of the rug. He was the one who saw the open book on the nightstand, its spine unbroken, a pressed camellia petal between the pages. And he was the one who read the note and felt, in the measured curvature of each letter, that this was not the handwriting of someone turning away from life, but of someone still trying to hold it steady. Sometimes people are thoughtful even in the end, the sheriff had told him. They make things orderly before they go. Jonah remembered wanting to answer, but this doesn't feel like goodbye. Instead, he just nodded, because he was young and the room was full of older silence than his own. Over the next few weeks, the town folded its absence into its routines. The school put up a framed photograph near the library, smiling with her hair pinned back, a stack of graded essays in her hands. A few students left flowers there. A few others walked past faster, eyes lowered, as if afraid of catching some invisible sorrow. Her small cottage on Maple Lane was emptied by a cousin who arrived from out of town and left again without lingering. Questions floated for a time, then settled like dust. Why had she written so little in her note, just a few lines about being tired and grateful? Why had there been no warning, no visible unraveling? Why did some people insist they had seen her laughing with a colleague only days before, eyes bright, future plans intact? But Auburn Grove was a place that believed in leaving certain doors closed. The official file marked the death as self-inflicted, and with that, the town exhaled. The sheriff retired a year later. Jonah moved on to other cases, other families, other rooms filled with the same quiet furniture of loss. And yet, whenever he drove past Maple Lane, he would slow down without thinking. The cottage was rented to new tenants, then painted a different color, then eventually torn down to make way for a larger house with broad windows and a swinging bench on the porch. But in his mind, the place remained suspended in its original form, small, pale, and lit by a single lamp in the front window. Sometimes, in the edge of sleep, he would see standing by that window, her profile turned slightly away, as if listening to someone speaking from a distance. He would wake with a strange ache in his chest, unable to say whether it was sympathy or regret. He told himself he had done all he could. The file was complete, the scene processed, the evidence, such as it was, carefully documented in neat handwriting. Yet there was a persistent, quiet misalignment inside him, like an unvoiced word sitting at the back of his tongue. Not doubt exactly, not certainty either. Just the feeling that an answer had been chosen because it was comfortable, not because it was true. Years passed. The town changed. New shops opened, old ones closed. Children who had once sat in his classroom grew into adults who spoke of her with a gentle haze around their memories. And still, the wind would occasionally rattle that loose window pane in his mind, a sound that refused to accept the silence that followed. What he could not know then was that the past, no matter how carefully folded away, does not rest. It waits. It lingers. It holds its breath, patient and watchful, until one small thing shifts, a misfiled form, a forgotten voice, a page that should have remained lost, and the still surface of a settled story begins to tremble. Death had been given a name, but some truths resist labels. They wait, quiet as a held breath, for someone to come back and ask the questions that were once too heavy to say aloud. 2. A forgotten witness or document reopens the cold investigation. It begins, as such things often do, with something small and almost accidental. Jonah is older now, his hair thinner, his face carrying the fine lines of years spent in rooms where people say "I don't know" while their hands reveal more than their words ever do. He has grown used to the weight of unsolved things, to the way certain names drift into his thoughts without warning. But's name has become an echo from another self, a quieter, nearly absorbed into memory. He is in the records room on a late afternoon, the kind of slow, dim day when time seems to move sideways. A newer detective has asked for help retrieving files from '92, something about an old burglary that might connect to a more recent case. Jonah moves through shelves like corridors of sleep, cardboard boxes, plastic bins, manila folders with corners softened by handling. When he pulls out the wrong folder, it is not dramatic. There is no sudden chill, no music that swells, just the faint whisper of paper sliding against paper. He glances down and her name is there, Collier. The file is thinner than he remembers, light in his hand. He hesitates, the other folder briefly forgotten. He could set it back. No one would know. But a quiet current moves through him, something between duty and curiosity, and he opens it. The first pages are expected. Initial reports, the sheriff's statements, the photograph of the bottle on the nightstand, the copy of the note. Jonah reads the words that once haunted him. "I'm sorry, I'm tired. Thank you for everything." He remembers how the sheriff had pointed to the note as if it were a door that closed the room. "There. She told us what we needed to know." Jonah's fingers move to the back of the folder, past the photographs and typed reports. He expects to find nothing else. Instead, a single paper slips loose and falls to the floor with a shallow, nearly soundless flutter. It is an old memo, handwritten, with a date that makes his eyebrows knot. December 3, 1992, 2 weeks after the case was closed. The writing is not his. It belongs to someone from the administrative staff back then. The lines are neat but hurried. Ray, phone call from student, claims to have seen Ms. Collier on Maple Lane night before reported time of passing. Student reluctant to give full account. Referred to sheriff. No further notes. Jonah feels a faint tightening in his throat. He flips through the rest of the file, searching for any reference to this call, a follow-up, an interview, anything. There is nothing. The memo sits alone, a fragment of a conversation that never became a complete thought. He closes his eyes for a moment. He can picture the sheriff's office back then, papers piled, phones ringing, priorities shifting according to noise and urgency. A reluctant student, a vague statement, a case already labeled and filed away. It would have been easy to let it slide. Too easy. When he opens his eyes again, he notices something else, a faint pencil mark at the bottom of the memo. A name, half-formed, then crossed out as if the writer had decided not to commit it to the page. The eraser mark is light, incomplete. Jonah tilts the paper towards the weak light overhead and squints. He can just make out the letters, L. He exhales slowly, a name almost remembered, a voice almost heard. Hours later, he is still thinking about it, even as he sits at his desk and pretends to focus on current files. The unfinished name, the student who called after the fact, the absence of any follow-up. He could dismiss it. Maybe the student had seen nothing unusual. Maybe it was a mistake, a confusion of dates. Maybe the sheriff had spoken to them informally and decided it was nothing worth adding to the file. Still, the thought persists. What if that voice had carried something no one wanted to hear? When he mentions it to the current chief, a practical woman with a calm, measuring gaze, she listens in silence, her fingers tracing the edge of the memo without touching it. "So this was never pursued?" she asks. "Not that I can see," Jonah answers. "After all this time, you think it matters?" Jonah looks at the memo again. The page feels like a small weight in the room. "I don't know if it changes what happened," he says slowly, "but it might change what we believe about it." There is a pause. The chief leans back. Through the window behind her, the late light catches dust in the air. "Things from that far back," she says at last, "they come with a price. People have built lives around what they think is true." He nods, "I know." "And you," she asks, eyes on him now instead of the paper. "You've lived with that file sitting quietly for a long time. Why open it now?" He hesitates. The true answer feels too fragile to say aloud, because it never felt completely finished, because I still hear the wind tapping the window. Instead, he replies, "Because someone tried to tell us something, and we didn't listen." She holds his gaze for a long moment, then lets out a soft breath. "All right," she says, "see what you can find, but tread carefully. We're not just walking into a case, we're walking into memory." He smiles without amusement. "Aren't we always?" That night he sits at his kitchen table with the file open in front of him and a pad of paper at his side. He writes the partial name, L. Then beneath it he adds a question. What did you see, and why did no one want to hear it? Outside his window, the wind rises, brushing against the house. It sounds, just for a moment, like an old pane of glass trembling in its frame. 3. Investigator focuses on human psychology, more than physical clues. The next morning, Jonah does not go first to old addresses or property records. He goes to the high school. It is not the same as it was in 1992, but certain details have remained. The long hallway with its row of lockers, the faint scuff marks on the tiled floor, the smell of paper and dust, and something faintly chemical. These spaces hold more than objects. They hold all the small, unresolved feelings of the people who once walked them. He sits with the current principal, a man in his 50s who folds his hands carefully on the desk, as though he is used to delivering measured responses. "We've been asked about Ms. Collier before," the principal says, after Jonah explains why he is there. "Mostly by former students. People remember her kindly." "I'm not here to question that," Jonah replies. "I'm looking for someone who might have called the station after her passing, someone whose name might have started with L. They were a student at the time." The principal frowns slightly, not in resistance but in thought. Yearbooks, he says after a moment. We can look. They pull out the 1992 yearbook and place it on the desk between them. Faces look up from the glossy pages, frozen mid-laughter or mid-shyness. Jonah lets his fingers move slowly across the photographs of the junior and senior classes, tracing the names printed beneath. Lainey Harper, Lewis Hardy. Yep. 3 possibilities, each a person who once carried the weight of being young in a small town, watching a beloved teacher vanish. He does not jot down their addresses or phone numbers yet. Instead, he asks, "Do you have any of her old class lists? Maybe some of her lesson plans?" The principal looks at him with mild surprise. "You're not looking for, wouldn't you want more?" "Physical evidence," Jonah finishes with a faint thinning of his lips. "New fingerprints, undiscovered reports." He shakes his head gently. "If this was about a hidden object, we'd have found it long ago. What we still haven't heard is what people kept to themselves." The principal watches him carefully. "You think someone held something back?" "I think people often do," Jonah says. "Not because they're unkind, but because they're frightened, or loyal, or unsure of what their truth might do to others." The principal nods slowly, as if that explanation makes a certain weary sense. He rises, searches through a cabinet, and returns with an old file box. Inside there are syllabi, attendance lists, a few handwritten notes in neat script. Jonah sifts through them carefully. Attendance sheets list names in tidy columns. Harper, Lainey appears in 2 classes. In one, Hardy, Lewis not at all. He feels a slight tug inside, not of certainty, but of a path becoming more distinct. "Do you remember anything about them?" he asks. "Lainey Harper or—" The principal, who had been a young teacher back then, leans back, eyes drifting upward as he searches memory. "Lainey was quiet, I think. Good grades. The kind of student who blends in because they don't cause trouble." He hesitates. "Was a bit more intense. Very bright, tended to see things others overlooked. Sometimes that made her uneasy to be around." Jonah nods. People who saw too much often learned early how to speak less. On his way out, he pauses by the old library. It has been renovated, but the layout is similar. He steps inside and just stands for a moment, feeling the ghost of another time pressing faintly against the bright new shelves. He imagines reading aloud here, her voice soft but sure. He imagines students listening, some leaning forward, some staring out windows, some pretending not to care while storing every word. What matters to him now is not which poem she chose or which page she turned to. What matters is the emotional map of the room. Who sat close, who sat far, who watched her with a blend of admiration and something more guarded. He has worked long enough to know that people rarely act without an emotional reason, even when they do not understand it themselves. Jealousy, admiration, gratitude, fear, these are not things you find in a fingerprint or a fiber. They live in pauses, in glances, in half-finished sentences. Later, when he reaches out and arranges to speak with the possible witnesses, he is careful with his questions. He meets Lainey Harper first, in a small just outside town. She is in her 40s now, hair pulled back, fingers wrapped around a mug as if it keeps her anchored. When he introduces the subject, her eyes darken slightly, but she does not pull away. "I remember her," Lainey says. "Everyone does. She was kind, not just to the students who stood out. She noticed the ones who tried not to be seen." "You were one of those?" Jonah asks gently. Lainey smiles faintly. "Most days." He watches her, not just her words but the way her shoulders tense when he brings up the time around's passing. "There was a record of a phone call," he says. Someone who believed they saw her on Maple Lane the night before the official time was recorded. The note suggests she was alone, that she had already made up her mind. But what if? He lets the sentence trail off, not because he lacks conclusion, but because he wants to see which ending she supplies. Lainey looks down at her hands. "I called," she says finally, so quietly that the words nearly vanish. "But it was after the news, after they said what had happened." "Why did you call?" She hesitates, then shrugs slightly, a gesture that carries years of practice dismissal. "I thought I saw her. That's all, near the corner by Maple Lane. She wasn't alone." Jonah waits. Silence opens between them, gentle but deep. "Who was she with?" he asks, still soft. Lainey's eyes flicker up, then away, as if checking some internal permission. I couldn't be sure," she replies. "It was dark. I just remember the shape of them, the way she tilted her head." She swallows. They were standing close, but not in a comfortable way, like they were arguing without raising their voices. He nods, absorbing the image. Two figures in the dark, close but not at ease. "Did you say that when you called?" "I tried," Lainey says. "The person on the phone sounded busy. They asked if I was certain it was the same night, and I said maybe. I was upset. I didn't want to get it wrong. They said someone would call back if they needed more, and no one ever did. After a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined it." "Why?" Her fingers tighten around the mug. "Because everyone said she had made her own choice. And if that was true, then what I saw didn't matter. It was easier to believe that." There it is, not conspiracy, but human self-protection. The mind's quiet way of erasing details that don't fit the story it needs in order to remain balanced. "Did you recognize anything about the other person?" he asks. "Height, build, the way they stood." Lainey thinks for a long moment. "They were taller than her," she says slowly. "Not by much. The way they held themselves, it reminded me of someone who's used to being listened to, like a teacher, or a parent, or," she trails off. "Lord." She shakes her head. "I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just matching faces backward now that so much time has passed." He doesn't push. He knows the difference between a memory and an invention is not always clear, especially when guilt has had decades to whisper its own version. When they part, he thanks her. She apologizes softly for not insisting more back then. "You were young," he tells her, "and you did speak. It isn't your fault that no one was listening carefully." Yet as he walks back to his car, he feels the familiar weight pressing at his ribs. It is not accusation. It is something closer to shared responsibility. The way a town, a system, a collection of individuals all participate in the stories they allow themselves to accept. Physical clues can be cataloged, measured, examined under clear light. But the deepest truths live in the spaces where people hesitated, the nights someone saw something and turned away, the moments when a single phone call was not given the time it deserved. As the sun lowers and the day moves on, Jonah writes 4 words in his notebook. She was not alone. The sentence offers no clear answers. It does not point a finger or provide a name. It simply shifts the ground under the old narrative, turning certainty into something softer, more unsettled. He closes the notebook and sits quietly for a while, listening to the hum of the world outside his parked car. This is how the mind reopens old rooms, gently, painfully, one remembered detail at a time. Jonah begins with maps, not of locations, but of connections, a list of names, the thin threads between them, the silences that might speak louder than any statement ever did. When dealing with people rather than objects, the lines are rarely straight. They bend, they waver, they dim and brighten depending on memory and guilt. In this world, even after so many years, There are people who still shift slightly when her name comes up, as if touched on a place they thought time had covered. He visits next. She works in a quiet design studio now, surrounded by mood boards and soft lighting, the kind of environment where emotions hide behind intention. She greets him politely, but when he mentions, her expression pauses just long enough to reveal an unhealed space. "I wondered when someone might come," she says. Her tone is calm, but her smile carries a tremble of remembered complexity. Back then, it felt like something important drifted away before any of us could name it. Jonah nods. He has learned that some people hold memories like photographs, crisp at the edges, preserved with care, while others hold them like water cupped in their hands, leaking slowly over the years. "Did you know her well?" he asks. Hesitates. "Not well, but she noticed me. She had that gift." She looks away, her gaze fixed on a corner of the studio where pinned sketches flutter in a faint draft. Some teachers see every student as a version of themselves. She didn't. She saw us as we were, even when we didn't want to be seen. Jonah studies this carefully. Admiration, yes, but also something more complicated. "Lainey mentioned she might have seen speaking with someone the night before her passing," he says. "Does that stir anything for you?" His breath catches in the quietest way. "I remember that night," she whispers, though the words seem pulled from somewhere deep. "Not because I saw her, but because something felt unsettled. People talk about intuition as if it's magical. I think it's simply the mind catching patterns it can't articulate." "What patterns?" Jonah asks. She closes her eyes briefly. Back then, there were moments when seemed close to someone. Not romantically, at least not openly, but emotionally. A person she trusted, leaned toward, even when she tried to remain reserved. Jonah keeps his voice steady. "A colleague." His fingers lightly trace the rim of her glass. Possibly someone older, someone who held a certain influence. It is not accusation, but it is direction, another thread on the map. Later that evening, Jonah meets with Thomas, a former of who now manages a small filled with worn paperbacks and soft light. Thomas speaks warmly of her, but with moments of hesitation, as if choosing which memories to offer and which to tuck back into the shadows. "She had a gentle way of carrying herself," Thomas says. "People felt comfortable around her, sometimes too comfortable." Jonah senses something under that, a quiet tension or perhaps unspoken longing. "Did anyone ever confide in her more than expected?" he asks. Thomas looks toward the back of the store, voice low. "People trusted her, that's all." But trust, Jonah knows well, can be its own kind of burden, especially when shared unevenly. He walks out into the night thinking about how affection, admiration, blurred feelings, and unspoken hopes weave themselves into a person's life. Had been surrounded by people who cared, who watched, who wondered. But care can turn uncertain when mixed with doubt or fear. Writes quietly in his notebook. "Love can look like loyalty. Loyalty can look like silence. Silence can hide more than blame." He feels the story shifting, not toward clarity, but toward deeper layers of uncertainty. 5. Old secrets unfold, revealing betrayal and hidden personal motives. The next step is unplanned. Jonah drives past the old library at dusk, the same one where once read poems to her classes. Light spills out through the windows in gentle gold, and something draws him inside. He wanders through aisles of books that hum with soft nostalgia. Behind the desk sits Carver, the former assistant librarian who had worked there during his time. She recognizes Jonah instantly, though decades have softened her features and added a kind steadiness to her eyes. "You're here about her," she says before he can speak. There is no fear in her voice, just the calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that truths return whether invited or not. "Yes," he replies. She sighs, her hands resting lightly on the desk. "I always assumed someone would come back eventually. That night, I should have said something, but it wasn't my place, or at least that's what I told myself." Jonah waits, letting the silence guide her. "She came here the afternoon before it happened," says. "She was quiet but not withdrawn, thoughtful the way she always was. She asked if she could leave something in my care, a letter." "A letter?" Jonah's pulse shifts softly. Nods. "I never saw what was inside. She sealed it herself. She asked me to give it to someone if anything ever happened to her, but she didn't specify what anything meant." "Do you still have it?" Opens a drawer beneath the desk and pulls out a small, worn envelope, edges slightly yellowed with time. Handwriting is soft but firm. "It was addressed to Thomas," says, "but after the news I hesitated. I told myself perhaps it wasn't meant to be delivered anymore. Perhaps she changed her mind. I kept it safe, just in case. But the right moment never came." Jonah studies the unopened envelope. He does not open it yet. Instead, he asks, "Did she seem troubled that day?" Shakes her head. Not troubled, just carrying something heavy she wasn't ready to share. Jonah leaves the library with the envelope held carefully, as if it contains not words but a heartbeat preserved in paper. At home, he places it on his table, the weight of its secrecy palpable. When he finally opens it, the letter is short. "Thomas, there are things I've tried to hold together, but some truths slip through even gentle hands. Please forgive me for what I could not say aloud. I hope one day you understand that my choices were never meant to cause harm. Please take care of them. They trust you, even if they do not say so." Lee. Jonah reads the note several times, sensing layers beneath layers. "Them. Not you. Not us. Them." He thinks of the students, of colleagues, of relationships that might have blurred the lines between guidance and attachment. Forgiveness. Understanding. Trust. Words that carry warmth and risk in equal measure. The next day, Jonah visits Thomas again. He shows him the letter. Thomas reads it with a stillness Jonah has not seen in him before. He looks up slowly, voice barely audible. "She wasn't speaking about me," he says. "She meant others, people she felt responsible for, people who leaned on her more than they should have." "Who?" Jonah asks gently. Thomas hesitates. "I think she was protecting someone, or perhaps more than one person, not from danger but from the consequences of their own confusion." Jonah nods. Emotional entanglements often hide themselves as guardianship, and guardianship can turn into quiet, internal conflict. "What did you need to be forgiven for?" Jonah asks. A long silence. Thomas's eyes soften. "For not being who she needed me to be. I cared for her, she knew that, and maybe that complicated things even if I never meant it to." The room is thick with gentle regret. No accusations, just the fragile weight of two lives that intersected too softly to anchor each other. Jonah leaves with a deeper understanding. His world was woven with affection that never found balance, affection that might have tangled her into choices she struggled to name. 6. Twist exposes the innocent as manipulative and morally corrupt. Jonah returns to Lainey one more time after a small detail from her earlier account tugs at his thoughts. She had mentioned the way the person with held themselves as if used to being listened to. That phrasing circles in his mind until it leads him to someone he overlooked, not a colleague, not a friend, but another student. Not Lainey, not Lewis Hardy. He was not in classes, but he was the kind of student who drifted where he wished, often unnoticed. He was known for charm that felt easy but insincere, kindness that flickered depending on the audience, words that pleased but never rooted themselves in truth. Students who remembered him now often did so with fondness, but also with a vague discomfort they couldn't name. Jonah finds him living in a small house outside town, working as a freelance consultant. Lewis greets him warmly, as if delighted to speak about a past he assumes is harmless. When Jonah brings up, Lewis's expression shifts, not in grief, not in discomfort, but in calculation. A brief flicker behind the eyes, quick as a blink. "I barely knew her," Lewis says lightly. Jonah studies him quietly. "You were seen with her the night before she passed." Lewis laughs gently, as if amused by a harmless misunderstanding. "Oh, that can't be right. People mix memories. It was a long time ago." Jonah lets silence fill the room until it feels almost like pressure. He watches Lewis's posture subtly change, shoulders tightening, jaw stilling. "You admired her," Jonah says gently. "Many students did, but admiration can turn complicated." Lewis's smile fades. "Are you implying something?" "I'm saying," Jonah murmurs, "that she cared deeply about protecting the people who turned to her, even when their feelings for her became something she didn't know how to handle." A muscle moves in Lewis's cheek, small but telling. "You think Lewis starts, then stops as if choosing his tone. "I never hurt her, I respected her." The word respected carries an edge that feels rehearsed. Jonah leans slightly forward, voice soft. "Did you ever ask more of her than she wished to give?" Lewis looks away. "I was young. People misunderstand things when they're young." "Did she misunderstand you?" Jonah asks. "Or did you prefer it that way?" Lewis's breath tightens. There it is, not guilt, but something subtler. The awareness of a line crossed, not in action but in intention, long ago. The understanding that influence can be a quiet force, especially when directed at someone gentle, someone who believed in protecting rather than confronting. "You think I caused her pain," Lewis says softly, "but you don't know the whole story." He stands, packing. "She cared about me. She said so. She said she understood me better than anyone else." Jonah watches him carefully. "Did she say that?" he asks. "Or did you hear what you wished to hear?" Lewis's silence answers for him. The truth that settles between them is not dramatic, not violent. It is slow and human and deeply unsettling. Lewis had leaned on her emotionally, pushed for closeness she tried gently to redirect, interpreted kindness as consent, dependence as devotion. He had manipulated the softness in her, not through force or threat, but through the quiet gravity of someone who wanted to be adored. And when she tried to step back, the emotional burden became heavy enough to bend her world into confusion. He was not responsible for what happened, but he had not been innocent. "People cared about her," Jonah says finally, "but some cared in ways that made her feel trapped." Lewis lowers his gaze. "Maybe," he whispers, "but I will never admit that to anyone else." Jonah rises, the room thick with the quiet truth. Sometimes harm is not a gesture but a pattern, not a moment but an influence. 7 concludes with open-ended moral tone. Hiding truth saves someone. By the time Jonah finishes gathering the threads, the story is no clearer than when he began. If anything, it is more shadowed, a tapestry woven with affection that blurred into pressure, care that softened into need, guidance that cracked under emotional strain. He sits alone at his desk late one evening, reviewing his notes. No single action explains what happened. No person carries full blame. Had tried to hold people's hearts with gentle hands, but the weight of their needs had finally grown too heavy. The letter to Thomas had been her attempt at farewell without numbing pain. The encounter on Maple Lane had been a quiet, emotional confrontation, not a threat. And Lewis, flawed, confused, unaware of the quiet impact he had, was a part of her emotional world but not a legal one. Revealing his role would destroy him without bringing her back. It would offer no justice, only damage. Jonah closes his notebook. He thinks of calm gaze in the old photographs. A woman who cared deeply but silently. A woman who carried more than others ever realized. He whispers into the empty room, "You tried your best, and we failed you by asking you to carry too much alone." The final report he writes is gentle, cautious, and incomplete. It states that new testimony reveals emotional tensions surrounding final days, suggesting she was not alone in her struggles. But it stops short of naming anyone responsible. It protects the living from burdens they do not fully understand. When he hands it to the chief, she reads it slowly, then looks at him. "This won't offer closure," she says. "It was never about closure," Jonah replies. "Some truths aren't meant to resolve. They're meant to remind us to listen more carefully." He leaves the station as dusk settles over the town. The air is soft, the wind carrying a faint, tremulous sound, like an old window pane gently shaking in its frame. He pauses, listening. It feels like a whisper from a past that never found rest, yet also never sought blame. Story ends not with certainty, but with recognition that lives are shaped not by answers, but by the quiet spaces where people feel unseen. As the evening deepens, Jonah walks on, unsure if justice or regret has won. The truth has surfaced, but it brings no absolution. Only a soft ache that lingers, fragile, quiet, deeply human. And in that ache, the past settles again, not resolved, but understood just enough to let the night breathe.